Thank you.
So I'm Louis, as Norman mentioned, I'm the Conservation Officer for Bug Life, and today I'm going to be talking firstly about beelines, which is our UK-wide project a bit more generally, and then how that feeds into RE-Betchworth's mini Meadows project within Betchworth. So we are Bug Life for the Invertebrate Conservation Trust. As Norman mentioned, we're the only conservation charity in Europe that's dedicated to the conservation of all invertebrates. And our aims for that are to stop the extinction of invertebrates and achieve sustainable populations of invertebrates. And we've got a three-pronged approach to achieving that, which is to create room for invertebrate, then make those areas safe for invertebrates, and also along the way building friendlier relationships between people and invertebrates. So when we sort of talk about invertebrates, it's kind of a made-up group. It doesn't really mean anything except grouping every animal that doesn't have an internal skeleton and backbone. But we can see the importance of that group. This is demonstrating that invertebrates actually make up 73% of all species on the planet. And that dwarfs groups that we think of as potentially bigger, such as microorganisms or plants and algae. But what's also really interesting is the vast majority of our conservation resources at the moment are dedicated to those top groups there, primarily birds and other vertebrates as well, such as mammals and reptiles and stuff. But actually they're making up less than a percentage of the species on the planet. And there's no point protecting them at all if we're not protecting the building blocks and the communities that those species are living off, which is invertebrates. They're making the base of that pyramid. And so what are we talking about? If we look at this here, we've got the main four groups, which a lot of my work relates around, which are the big pollinator groups. So that's your flies with about 7,000 species, your bees and wasps, which are about 9,000 species in the UK, 2,600 species in the UK of butterflies and moths, and about 4,000 species of UK beetle. Interestingly, about 1 in 4 animals on the planet Earth is a beetle. But then we've also got other groups such as dragonflies, spiders, snails and earthworms that are all really providing really important roles on our planet. But also there are groups that we haven't even begun to assess accurately yet, such as the nematodes and mites. So we really don't know the extent of their importance or in fact their number. And that's making up about 40,000 UK species. And I like to just share some photos of some of the pictures I've taken of invertebrates around the county. So these are all taken within Surrey, but just highlight some of the beauty of our invertebrates. So we've got iridescent rose chafers. This is a large skipper butterfly. You might see these come out en masse in spring, the red soldier beetles that can be seen all around. This brilliant photo of one of our solitary bees that we have quite a lot of in the county. It's a green-eyed flower bee that see lots of on heaths in particular. And marmalade hoverfly there taken on Wisley Common, that is. But what's the point? Why are we all here? Why should we help invertebrates? So I think there's an argument that I hope you guys share with me, which is that all life is valuable and has a right to protection and space on this planet that we share it with. And this is something that's reflected in a lot of spiritual and religious obligations. That it's our responsibility to look after life. And then if we move on to how they really service us, in a non-financial way, they provide many people a great deal of pleasure and inspiration, and also really importantly, providing people a connection to their natural environment, and really important for health and well-being. But then if you really want to just nail it down and quantify it, in terms of financial resources and provisioning, they're really important as well. So this is a far from comprehensive list, but in terms of pollination, 90% of our crop species are reliant on insect pollination. in terms of soil creation as well. In this country, it's valued at £16 billion to the UK economy each year in just the topsoil layer alone. So that's not even including the subsoil layer. And there's many more to that list, but it's also important to highlight that in terms of future assets, we can't even begin to quantify what they might provide us in the future going forwards as well. Why are they under threat? So we hear about it a lot in the news, and it's basically a combination of stressors that humans are responsible for. So it's the usual things such as climate change, an increased use in pesticide and fertilizer use in our agricultural spaces, but also actually our urban spaces as well. An increase in artificial light pollution reaching wild spaces. But the biggest cause of decline in invertebrates to date has been the loss of habitat and the subsequent fragmentation of those habitats. We've actually lost 97% of our wildflower rich, which is our most biodiverse habitats. And that loss has occurred in just since the 1930s. So that's a massive area of about 3 million hectares, which is equal to the size of Wales, basically, has been lost of these habitats in the UK alone. And as I sort of mentioned, that's caused a fragmentation of those remaining natural habitats as well. And that's really visible if we take this example of the Dorset heaths here. So you can see between 1811 to 1960s, the massive decline in heathland habitat that was experienced there. And it's not just the decline in the habitat themselves, but the increase in the distances between them, which are huge, vast distances for our invertebrates to move between. And what that means is that they can't respond to emerging threats such as climate change if they want to move north in the country for cooler climates, or if one of those sites experiences a wildfire. As I'm sure many of you are aware, we had several bad wildfires last year in our county ourselves, but they can't go to re-inhabit those areas either. And the driver of this fragmentation has been the usual suspects. Again, it's urban development encroaching into our countryside, intensification and encroachment of agricultural land uses, and other things like planting of monocultures for forestry, as well as heathland, as well as, things like golf courses and recreational use of our countryside. And unfortunately, the result of that has been widespread extinction of our invertebrates. We've lost 1,260 in the last 100 years within the UK, unfortunately. And we're seeing that our invertebrates are unfortunately declining at a faster rate than many other groups as well, with 389 identified extinctions globally by the IUCN versus 123 plants in the same period. Well, a lot of these figures are unlikely to be painting the true picture, with 250 UK beetles not seen since the 1970s. And if we're to bring it to a really local level, we've lost 12% of Surrey's invertebrates. And that was in the State of Nature report, which I think is a 20-year period in the lead up to 2015. And we're expecting these trends to accelerate with climate change, unfortunately. But believe me, I don't want this to just be a doom and gloom, depressing talk. We're here to provide a really nice, positive, creative solution to this problem. And the idea is to reconnect our landscape. And we're doing that through what we call B lines. They stand for biodiversity lines, somewhat confusingly, rather than Bs. But they represent the world's largest, most joined up habitat connectivity project, which is maybe a bit wordy, but they're essentially looks like this. It's a sort of motorway map of 3 kilometre wide lines, and they go across the best remaining areas for wildlife. And the idea is to fill them with further wildflower rich habitat so that our wildlife can move within these lines. And it's not just going to be about insects. This will be beneficial for all animals, including things like birds and mammals, as well as the insects that I'm interested in. And this is the reason we're doing this, just to provide a coordinated approach. If we were to just put dots wherever we could find places to put wildflower habitat, it would take 5 times greater resource input and 5 times greater land use than if we were to follow our approach, which we just don't have in conservation today. Quite excitingly as well, in the new pollinator bill that was adopted by the EU, this is going to be rolled out across the extent of the EU as well. So in the coming years, they're going to be mapping their own bee lines. It'll be called buzz lines over there, but it is, again, the work of bug life that has caused that. So this is a massive international habitat connectivity project that we're talking about here. And if we're to bring that to a local scale, you can see the areas we're talking about in Surrey. So it's joining up essentially the North Downs, as well as the Thames Basin heaths and the Wealden heaths in the county. And if we're to look at where that is relative to Betchworth, this isn't the best. I should have zoomed in slightly more, but you can see we're situated below Headley Heath, and Betchworth is sort of lying across with the northern half in the bee line above the roundabout and the station, which I think is where Norman's initially targeted this mini Meadows project that we're going to be getting onto, but also extending off the bee line into more towards the centre of Betchworth, so linking up to providing a habitat corridor to the habitat corridor in essence. So that's really nice local initiative there to build on the work that we've been doing. And so for this project, we're going to be looking at gardens, and I think it's just first really important to highlight, you know, the potential that we have in our gardens. So we like to say whether you have a field, a plot or a pot, you can put a building block in the bee line. And Dave Goulson, who's a very prominent now writer about insect conservation and researcher, in fact, highlights that we have 22 million gardens and 300,000 allotments in the UK. And that amounts to 500,000 hectares of land. So if we were all doing a bit for our pollinators in our own patch, we could really deliver something quite substantial. And there's also a range of options of what you can do in your garden, which I'll be getting into with this meadow project, either for the avid gardener all the way to the sort of sit back and relax gardener. I also just want to quickly mention that we're seeing modern trends where actually a lot of our pollinators are doing better in gardens as well. And that's because they're providing a refuge from the big mechanized agriculture and the input of highly toxic chemicals that are hitting our pollinator populations quite hard as well. So this is a really valuable place to be doing some work, even though it may feel like it's on a smaller scale. It has really great potential. But that said, it's not just about put up a bee hotel and leave it there. It's more complicated than that when delivering for our invertebrates. And so this is basically the principle. So we need to provide the resources and the food that our pollinators rely on. And that's basically mainly flowers. And they need to be specialised, diverse, they need to be UK native flowers. Then we also need to provide the right conditions for reproducing of those insects. That's the host plants that some of the larval species like caterpillars need, as well as the nesting sites and the right, what we call microhabitats, which are, you know, microclimates and refuge areas and stuff like that. But then they might have other specialist needs on top of that as well. So that could be things like hibernation areas, nesting material, or different types of specialist food that some communities need. And that's where the Mini Meadows project comes in. So a wildflower meadow provides that, all of those factors for our invertebrates. It provides forage, refuge, nesting sites, all of what we've just mentioned. So this is a really nice project, and by delivering a wildflower meadow in your garden, you're going to be able to deliver all of those things for invertebrates, and you'll see a big uptick in the biodiversity and the invertebrate flora you see in your fauna you see in your garden. So now we're going to go into how to make a meadow, some of the challenges to do that, and basically we'll go into two different approaches into how you want to create a mini meadow in your garden. And so the first of those is we're going to be talking about reseeding of meadows, and as part of this project we've provided, which will be distributed by Norman, wildflower mix seeds to create your own mini meadow in your garden, and these will be with UK native wildflowers that are ideal for our invertebrates. But unfortunately, it's not just a case of throw the seed on the grass, some people expect. The big problem with meadow management is controlling grass, and really vigorous grasses, as you see in the picture there, will just outcompete wildflowers. There's no chance of them surviving that, they'll be smothered. So to start, when you're creating your meadow, you want to cut your grass as short as possible, and importantly, remove those cuttings. So put them in a compost or piling them to make a sort of habitat pile in one area of the garden is really important. And you can do that just by raking it off, or if you have a collect mower, it will do it for you. You then want to create bare patches of soil. This is important, again, for preventing outcompeting of our grasses, but also enabling the right condition for wildflower seeds to germinate in. So you can see what we're sort of going for in the bottom image there. So that can be done with hand tools, such as rakes, or if you've got a good rake that's a metal one rather than one of the plastic ones, or sort of forks or spades, yeah, whatever, just to break up that really thick competitive grasses. We were aiming for 50% bare ground. And then when we're getting onto that, that's where we want to sow once you've done your groundworks. There's a bit of debate over the sowing rate that's good to go for, but it's between 1 and 4 grams per square meter, but I think in a garden setting we'd go quite high, so the upper end of that. And you just want to scatter the seed onto the surface, particularly the bare ground. You're not aiming to bury the wildflower seed, importantly. The wildflower seed will need light to germinate it, so you're just trying to get it on the top of the soil there. It's then really important to roll or trample with your feet after you've set that seed to make sure there is seed to soil contact. You don't want the seed being kept off the ground by grass or other vegetation, as it won't germinate there. And then of course, just make sure there's some water coming down, whether that's rain or whether you water it after seeding. Now, I just wanted to quickly highlight, so we've gone into this ground preparation, but it's important to note that it takes time and to manage expectations when seeding a UK native wildflower meadow. So realistically, you're not going to see a big uptake in the first year, and it could take up to 2 years before you see real results. And we're looking at the sort of area there that's not everyone's cup of tea in their garden. So what we're sort of suggesting for this, if you're really ambitious and you want to just go ahead and use the seed and do your whole garden, then go for it. That's really encouraging to hear, but you've been warned essentially. But you can also just do a patch of your garden in somewhere that's less visually disruptive, if that's how you feel about it, and then hopefully those wildflowers will spread out to the rest of the garden with time after establishment. It's also really important to note that even at this in-between phase, they can be providing a lot for our invertebrates. So that bare ground can be really good nesting, and you'll see a few species come up in that in the middle of that will already be providing more foraging for our invertebrates. So don't feel like this is a failure if it looks like this for the first year. It's part of the process, essentially. However, if you're thinking, oh God, I don't want to do that to the entirety of my lawn, there is other options. So this is what the sort of natural regeneration process. You may have heard of no-mow May, but in reality, it's a bit more no-mow from March through to August. You can see on the left, this is what you might expect by utilizing that method. In the first year, you'll get longer grass, a few flower species, and this is already so much better for wildlife. You're providing refuge for many of our invertebrates as well as floral resources. And then after a few years, you'd expect to see an uptick in the number of floral species you've got in there and the representation, and more flowers as you let them flower and set seed as nature intended. And this would prevent you having to put up with big scale groundworks and the visual look of that in the long term. But it's important to manage a meadow as it goes on, regardless of which method you take up. So meadows are the product of traditional agriculture. Traditionally, they would have been cut for hay in August, in late summer, and then grazed with livestock through the autumn and in the spring as well. And this was really useful to maintain low nutrients in the soil that our wildflowers love. And so we want to recreate those conditions. So we don't want to see what we see in the image here of mowing the lawn and then all the cuttings going straight back out, as this will keep the nutrient level high. And it will also smother the wildflowers that are trying to establish. So what we want to do is we want to cut our mini meadows and then remove that grass again and compost it or create a habitat pile to drive those nutrient levels down, which in turn stunts the grass growth and allows our wildflowers to have a competitive chance. Then before the growing season in February or March, again, we want to perform another cut just to make sure those grasses are in check as we're expecting wildflowers to germinate. You might, if you've reseeded or created bare ground, you might see a sudden uptick in certain weeds, particularly thistles or docks. So you just want, they can be good for pollinators, but we don't want too much of any one thing. So just keep them under control. We are trying to create a meadow here. So particularly the high thistles can be a problem. And then periodically as well, maybe like once a year, roughing up that ground to mimic what we'd see from livestock in traditional meadows, creating a bit of bare ground that allows wildflowers to germinate again. But also that bare ground's really important for certain insects that love basking or nest directly into bare ground as well. When cutting a meadow as well, it's also really helpful to leave areas uncut, as these can provide refuge for invertebrates that overwinter in longer areas of grass, or having really good sort of bushy hedges in the nearby vicinity as well. But also when managing a meadow, you'll see an increase in the diversity and what it's providing for nature over time. So just maintaining that commitment, not getting disheartened. It's a bit of a holistic experience creating a wildflower meadow, so just sticking with it. And you'll see some results. You'll see the results improve as you go through time. And just lastly, to mention on our website, you can see the URL in the bottom right there, but we've got an interactive map of the beeline, and all of these blue dots are where people have mapped stuff that they've done for invertebrates, which is really helpful. So if you're doing a mini meadow, please tell us about it, tell us how it's going. And yeah, we'd love to hear about it. So please do map for it. Sometimes people struggle to find the button, so it's up there in the top right where it says add site. And yeah, thank you for listening. And I wish you the best of luck with the Mini Meadows project. And it's really exciting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've got some questions in the chat.
We have. I was going to let Norman
run this section with the questions. Yes, we have some questions, and I'm sure there are going to be others. I'm afraid I've got about 5 more, but that's not the point, is it? So why don't you ask those one? How do we? I'm going to start with, how do we trample stuff in? How do we best resemble heavy animals, and not, as Pam asked the question, get the birds to eat everything?
So I think when doing it on a larger scale, they do have rollers, which is really helpful. You can get handheld rollers that are quite easy to use, but I think you're just trying to maintain that contact, and I think you can just do it with your feet. Ideally, look at your shoes and make sure you're not picking up all of the seed in question. As I think someone mentions in the chat, they've used sand to make the seed a bit more visible so you can see what you're doing with it. I've seen other people sort of tamp it down with the sort of blunt side of a metal rake as well, but you're just trying to press it into the soil. I'm sure you probably will get birds eating some of it. I've never seen it suggested, as with other grass mixes, of putting thorny bushes on top to stop them accessing it. I think birds can usually get under that, but I think hopefully the sowing rate is just going to mean that some prevails, I guess. But yeah, it's one that I'd be interested to find out myself. I mean, we sow the meadows and they do take up, so hopefully some of it's making it through the birds, but yeah.
What other questions are there that you can answer, Louis?
So someone here mentions, is harrowing good? Yes, harrowing is good if you've got the means to do that. The carbon release from the soil, I guess there is a carbon impact of that, but you are also creating a natural habitat and that provides for invertebrates, and the harrowing is going to be a one-time thing, and then hopefully by collecting the grass it will result in some carbon sequestration in the long term. So there probably is a slight carbon impact of that, but this is the thing with traditional management of some of these sites. It's not like you're running a fossil fuel plant, but things like heathland management and grassland management might have some carbon impacts, but then a lot of it might get grown, might draw down more carbon through the growing season and turning that into grass and stuff. In an ideal world, there'd be places to put your arisings that would process them, so that that carbon wasn't going back out through composting, but unfortunately that infrastructure doesn't exist on any real scale in this country. There's also a mention of using sand to stop it blowing away. Yeah, using and providing initial moisture. Yeah, we would recommend that. It's also, using sand can be really helpful for getting the sowing densities right. We're talking about quite small grams per meter square area there. Some people find that quite hard to judge, sprinkling 4 grams, whereas if you bulk it up with the sand, you're dealing with a larger quantity, while the sand's also more visible on the soil. So that is something that's really helpful if you've got that available to you. It's probably not completely essential on the scale we're talking about, but if you're hand sowing a large meadow, you'd probably want that as a necessity. But in a small area, it's probably less of an issue.
Couple more just come up, Louis. How much of the meadow should be left uncut, and do you need to dig up grass roots?
You don't necessarily need to dig up grass roots for this process. There are processes where people do uproot grasses, and that's something that would be mimicked in by livestock, but I wouldn't say that's necessary when doing a wildflower meadow in your garden in any way. In terms of leaving areas uncut, we'd probably go for the verges between hedges and stuff in your garden. When we're doing it on a large scale and managing a big wildflower meadow, there's a lot of leaving areas of scrub, leaving areas longer. And there are figures to put on that, but I think it's holistic. I'd say probably under 15 15% maximum leave uncut, because you do want to get that nutrients off. But yeah, verges are really good for that, around the edges of the garden, or you can do strips into the middle of the garden as well, which sometimes people refer to as a beetle bank in sort of agricultural environments.
Okay, one last question, which was about yellow rattle from my wife, and any tips on how to get it going, and then we'll hand over to Norman.
Yeah, it's a bit of a contentious debate. I mean, they call it the meadow maker. It is just so helpful for suppressing that really vigorous grass growth, which is the challenge with establishing a meadow. There's plenty of YouTube resources out there, but some of them do contradict each other. So I'd say a bit of experimentation. Some principles, old yellow rattle seed does not stay viable for long. So when you get yellow rattle, you want to get it into the ground quickly. It needs a frost to activate it. So ideally, you're having it in the ground over winter, which unfortunately, due to just when this project arrived, we haven't got the ideal time for. Putting it in the freezer, some people say it works, some people say it doesn't work. But I've got colleagues who have had great success with putting yellow rattle seed in a freezer for 2 weeks. But then I've seen other people reporting that it's more complicated than just cold from freezer. There's things like light and damp. So it is a real sort of contentious thing. And the goal is to get your yellow rattle going, and then hopefully the rest of it will be easier, but there's no hard and fast rule. But if you follow the guidance we followed in general, hopefully it will take off in some form, and then it will build in its establishment in the meadow.